For 40 years, the world believed silence was peace. They believed that when the streets of Kampala fell quiet, justice had been served. They believed that a dynasty built on the bones of the disappeared could rule forever without consequence. They were catastrophically wrong. Tonight, the marble halls of the United States Senate echo with a sound that has been absent for decades, the machinery of accountability grinding into motion. The Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, a weapon designed to hunt down the architects of oppression, is being sharpened for deployment. The target is not just any military strongman. It is General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, the heir apparent to a throne built on terror, the tweeting prince who believed the internet made him untouchable, while his dungeons made him invincible. But this is not simply the story of one warrant or one arrest. This is the story of a collision between two Africas, the Africa that kneels and the Africa that stands. And at the center of this collision stands a figure that no one anticipated, Captain Ibrahim Traore. Do not look away. What happens in these moments will not merely decide the fate of Uganda. It will determine whether dignity can triumph over dynasty, whether sovereignty can defeat submission. If this story moves you, if it stirs something deep in your spirit, then stay with us. This is more than breaking news. This is the breaking of chains that have bound a continent for generations. Show your support with a like, a comment, or a subscription, not for numbers, but because every voice that joins this chorus makes the song of freedom stronger. To understand why the world is finally listening, we must walk through the shattered glass of a home in Magere. The assault on Bobiwine's compound was not law enforcement, it was the desecration of dignity. When state security forces, their breath thick with alcohol and their hearts drunk on impunity, smashed through the sanctuary of a family, they did more than break windows. They broke the last thread of legitimacy that held the Museveni dynasty together. Barbie Kyagulanyi's testimony, delivered through tears that no mother should ever shed, became the match that lit a wildfire of global fury. Her words, trembling but unbroken, described men in uniform who answered to no law except their own appetites for violence. This was not an isolated incident. This was the system revealing its true face. The Global Magnitsky Act is surgical in its precision and devastating in its reach. It does not topple governments, it suffocates them. When your assets freeze in London, when your visas vanish in Washington, when your children are expelled from universities in New England, you discover that the world becomes very small for those who make it very dark for others. For General Muhoozi, the man who tweets threats as easily as others send birthday wishes, the internet may be vast, but a prison cell is not. Yet as the legal machinery of the West began its slow grind toward justice, something unprecedented happened in Ouagadougou. While diplomats in Washington prepared their carefully worded statements of condemnation, while European capitals readied their sanctions, Captain Ibrahim Traore stepped to a podium and delivered words that would silence every assumption about African solidarity. But what Ibrahim Traore said, and why he said it when the world was finally acting against African tyranny, reveals a truth so uncomfortable that it has sent shockwaves through every capital from Brussels to Beijing. His speech did not celebrate the West's sudden discovery of human rights. Instead, it exposed the architecture of a system that creates the very monsters it later claims to hunt. The Uganda crisis has become a mirror, and what it reflects is a pattern as old as colonialism itself. For 4 decades, American taxpayers funded the very military that terrorizes Ugandan civilians. The tear gas canisters fired into peaceful crowds whose factory produced them, the armored vehicles that patrol the streets of Kampala at midnight, whose assembly line built them, the drones, those windowless vans of terror that snatched the youth of Uganda from their families whose contracts made them possible. Traore's intervention stripped away the comfort of moral distance. His words forced a reckoning with an uncomfortable truth. You cannot fund the whip and then claim to be the savior of the one being lashed. The timing of this legal storm is no accident. Intelligence reports suggest a carefully orchestrated plan to militarize the 2026 elections, to transform ballot boxes into ammunition depots. The dynasty knows that demographic reality has sentenced them to defeat. 75% of Uganda's population was born after Museveni took power. They have no memory of his liberation struggle, only the weight of his oppression. But there is something moving in the shadows of this crisis, something that even the most sophisticated Western sanctions cannot control. Across Africa, a generation is watching. In Nairobi, in Lagos, in Accra, young voices are asking why they should wait for Washington to grant them permission to breathe freely. The regime in Kampala is not merely facing an arrest warrant, it is facing the expiration of its relevance. But like a wounded beast, It is preparing to strike with a ferocity that will test every assumption about how far a dynasty will go to preserve itself. What happens next will not be decided in courtrooms or committee hearings. It will be decided in the hearts of those who have chosen to stand rather than kneel, to speak rather than whisper, to act rather than hope. But the most dangerous element in this equation is not the regime's desperation or the West's sudden awakening to justice. It is the voice that dared to ask why the world's conscience only awoke when the dynasty began to crumble, and what that voice plans to do about it. The moment Captain Ibrahim Traore stepped to that podium, every assumption about African politics shattered like glass hitting concrete. While the world expected gratitude for the West's sudden intervention, what they received instead was a mirror held up to their own complicity, and the reflection was unbearable. Traore did not speak as a politician seeking favor or a diplomat choosing careful words. He spoke as a soldier who had seen enough, a leader who understood that true justice cannot be imported in the cargo holds of foreign planes. His voice cut through the diplomatic theater with the precision of a surgical blade. "How," he asked, looking directly into the cameras that carried his words across continents, "can those who provided the whip now claim to be the saviors of the one being lashed? How can those who fed the beast for 40 years suddenly discover it has teeth?" The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of truth so stark that even the most seasoned diplomats found themselves speechless. For 4 decades, the same powers now drafting arrest warrants had poured billions into the very military machine that terrorized Uganda's people. The numbers are staggering and undeniable. Since 1986, Uganda has received over $15 billion in military aid, development assistance, and strategic support from Western allies. Every armored vehicle that rumbles through Kampala's midnight streets, every surveillance system that tracks dissidents, every communication network that coordinates the drones, these were not built in Ugandan workshops. They were shipped, installed, and maintained by the very nations now discovering the concept of human rights accountability. Traore's words expose the grotesque arithmetic of strategic patience. When you fund a regime's capacity for oppression and then express shock at its brutality, you are not a liberator, you are an accomplice seeking absolution. Let us take a moment here, not to rush forward, but to give thanks. Write a comment with a simple thank you to Traore, to the spirit of sovereignty, or to the courage of those who refuse to bow. Gratitude is not a formality, it is recognition, it is dignity expressed in words. When you add your voice of thanks, you are standing in solidarity with the story of freedom and pride. Take this pause to comment your thanks. Together, those words become a beacon that shines far beyond the screen. The reaction to Traore's intervention was immediate and polarizing. In Washington, the carefully constructed narrative of moral leadership began to crack. How do you maintain the fiction of being the world's policeman when a young African captain publicly exposes your role as the world's arms dealer? In European capitals, the discomfort was palpable. Brussels, which had spent decades crafting aid packages that required political compliance, suddenly found itself confronted with a leader who demanded dignity before dollars. Paris, still reeling from its ejection from the Sahel, watched as another of its former spheres of influence embraced the dangerous idea that sovereignty means saying no. But it was in Uganda itself where Traore's words carried the most explosive force. For the first time in 40 years, the people of Kampala heard their suffering placed in its proper context. Their oppression was not an accident of history or a failure of development. It was the deliberate product of a system that required their subjugation to function. The youth of Uganda, those born into a world where Museveni was not a liberator but a life sentence, began to see their struggle through new eyes. They were not victims of an African problem requiring Western solutions. They were casualties of a global system that had sacrificed their freedom for strategic convenience. Across the continent, a generation raised on the mythology of Western benevolence suddenly understood that their poverty was not natural but engineered, their instability not inevitable but induced. The same powers that spoke eloquently about democracy in their parliaments had bankrolled dictatorships in African capitals. Traore had done something more dangerous than criticizing policy. He had revealed the machinery behind the curtain, and once you see how the machine operates, you can never again pretend that its products are accidents. The Uganda crisis was no longer just about one tyrant and his heir. It had become a referendum on the entire architecture of dependency that had kept Africa kneeling for generations. The choice facing the continent was binary: continue to beg for liberation from those who had built the prisons, or break the chains with their own hands. But even as Traore's words echoed across capitals and sparked uncomfortable conversations in corridors of power, something darker was stirring in the heart of the Museveni palace. The regime, feeling the noose of sanctions tightening and hearing the echo of Traore's truth-telling, had begun to activate a plan so desperate and so destructive that it would force the world to confront the true price of its strategic patience. Intelligence sources whispered of midnight meetings where the decision was made to abandon even the pretense of democracy. The 2026 elections would not be rigged, they would be cancelled. Not through constitutional means, but through the declaration of a state of emergency so comprehensive that it would transform Uganda into a fortress ruled by fear. But as the regime prepared its final gambit, they had forgotten one crucial element. The wind of change that Traore had unleashed was already inside their walls, carried in the hearts of every young officer who had heard his words and wondered if their oath was to a nation or to a family's bank account. The confrontation was no longer between East and West, between democracy and dictatorship. It had become a battle between yesterday and tomorrow, between the Africa that accepts and the Africa that demands. What emerged from this collision would determine not just Uganda's fate, but whether an entire continent would continue to outsource its liberation or finally claim it with their own hands. The midnight meetings in State House Entebbe were not planning an election campaign, they were orchestrating a funeral, not for a person, but for the very concept of democratic transition in Uganda. As international pressure mounted and Traore's words continued to reverberate across the continent, the Museveni dynasty made a calculation as cold as it was desperate. If they could not win legitimately, they would ensure that legitimacy itself became irrelevant. The plan, codenamed Fortress Uganda, was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The constitutional government would be suspended under the pretext of national security. The internet would be severed, isolating the nation from global scrutiny. Opposition leaders would not be arrested. They would simply disappear into a network of safe houses that had been expanded for precisely this purpose. But perhaps most chilling of all, the plan included provisions for what intelligence sources describe as regional destabilization, the deliberate spreading of chaos into neighboring countries to create the justification for indefinite military rule. When your legitimacy expires, you manufacture the crisis that makes legitimacy seem like a luxury the nation cannot afford. This was the scorched earth option that even veteran observers of African politics thought belonged to a bygone era. The dynasty had decided that if they could not rule Uganda, they would ensure that no one else could either. Yet as these plans crystallized in the palace, something unprecedented was happening in the barracks. For the first time in 40 years, the Ugandan military was experiencing what intelligence analysts termed ideological fragmentation. Young officers, many of whom had heard Ibrahim Traore's words broadcast on underground radio networks, began asking questions that shook the foundations of military hierarchy. The questions were simple but devastating. Why should a professional army serve a family business? Why should soldiers trained to defend the nation become the enforcers of a dynasty? Why should men who had sworn an oath to Uganda find themselves protecting the bank accounts of a privileged few? These were not the whispered doubts of isolated dissidents. These were the open conversations of an officer corps that had watched their counterparts across the continent choose dignity over dependency. In Burkina Faso, they saw young soldiers who had traded the comfort of foreign patronage for the harder path of authentic sovereignty. In Mali and Niger, they witnessed armies that had chosen their people over their paymasters. The choice facing Uganda's military was becoming binary: remain loyal to a fading dynasty and face international pariah status, or protect the institution of the army from the toxic legacy of hereditary rule. This moment crystallizes everything that Ibrahim Traore represents to the old order, the nightmare of a soldier who remembers that his gun belongs to the nation, not the general. Traore's model offers something more dangerous than military intervention. It offers the possibility of military integrity. You are part of something bigger than a channel right now. You are part of a community that refuses to let these narratives be written by outsiders. If you want to join that community more deeply, if you want to support the team bringing these stories to life, become a member. Your contribution directly funds better research, deeper investigations, clearer truth. You are not just supporting Bright Africa. You are supporting every leader, every nation, every voice fighting for independence and dignity. Join us and stand with the principle that African wealth belongs to Africa. The pressure within Uganda's power structure was reaching a breaking point. Senior commanders found themselves caught between two impossible choices: follow orders that would turn them into international criminals, or break ranks and face immediate elimination by the regime's inner circle. But the most dangerous pressure was not coming from above. It was rising from below. The conscripts and junior officers who formed the backbone of Uganda's military were no longer the rural youth who had once seen military service as their only escape from poverty. These were young men who carried smartphones, who had watched their peers across the continent choose dignity over desperation. They had seen what happened in Burkina Faso when soldiers decided that their oath was to the nation, not to the palace. They had witnessed how quickly a professional military could restore national pride when it served the people instead of the powerful. The Uganda crisis had evolved beyond a confrontation between a regime and its opposition. It had become a struggle for the soul of the military itself, the institution that would ultimately determine whether the dynasty's fortress strategy succeeded or collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. As international sanctions began to bite and diplomatic isolation deepened, the regime's capacity to maintain loyalty through rewards evaporated. In a dictatorship, loyalty is often a commodity, and the price of that commodity was skyrocketing beyond the dynasty's capacity to pay. The Magnitsky sanctions were not merely freezing bank accounts, they were severing the financial arteries that kept the patronage system alive. When you cannot pay the men who protect you, their protection becomes conditional at best and hostile at worst. But perhaps the most corrosive element in the regime's calculations was the growing realization that their heir apparent, General Muhoozi, was not an asset but a liability. His erratic social media presence, his public threats against neighboring countries, his obvious unfitness for leadership. These were not the quirks of a crown prince, but the death rattles of a dynasty that had confused inheritance with merit. The choice facing Uganda was no longer between reform and stagnation. It was between transformation and destruction, between evolution and explosion. The fortress strategy might buy the dynasty months or even years, but it could not indefinitely postpone the reckoning that demographic reality had made inevitable. As dawn broke over Kampala, two flags flew in the morning wind, one representing the future that Traore's example had made possible, another clinging to a past that refused to acknowledge its own expiration. The question was not which flag would survive, but how much of the nation would remain standing when the choice was finally made. The fortress walls that the Museveni dynasty had built around Uganda were not made of stone. They were made of silence, fear, and the accumulated weight of 40 years of unopposed power. But walls built on such foundations cannot withstand the force of truth, and the truth that Ibrahim Traore had spoken was spreading like wildfire through the very institutions the regime thought it controlled. In the pre-dawn hours of what would become known as Liberation Day, the choice that had been building for months finally crystallized. In barracks across Uganda, young officers faced their moment of reckoning. They could remain loyal to a dynasty that viewed them as expendable assets, or they could honor their oath to defend Uganda itself, not the bank accounts of those who happened to rule it. The decision came not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet dignity of soldiers who simply refused to participate in their own country's destruction. When orders came to implement the fortress strategy to cut internet cables, to arrest opposition leaders, to fire on crowds of civilians, something unprecedented happened. The orders were acknowledged, filed, and ignored. The dynasty had forgotten the most fundamental rule of authoritarian rule. You cannot compel loyalty, you can only purchase it. And when your currency becomes worthless, when international sanctions freeze your assets, when your promises become jokes, when your heir apparent becomes an embarrassment, loyalty evaporates like morning mist. The collapse, when it came, was not violent but inevitable. Like a building whose foundation has been quietly eroded, the regime simply crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. General Muhoozi's final tweets were not threats of retaliation but desperate pleas for relevance that no one bothered to read. The transformation was as swift as it was complete. Within hours, the windowless vans that had terrorized Kampala's streets for decades were repurposed as medical ambulances. The safe houses that had hidden the regime's crimes became community centers. The surveillance equipment that had tracked dissidents was redirected to monitor infrastructure and ensure public safety. But perhaps the most powerful symbol of change was the moment when Barbie Kyagulanyi, the woman whose testimony had helped trigger this entire transformation, walked freely through the gates of State House, not as a prisoner or petitioner, but as a citizen reclaiming her country's most sacred spaces. Take a second right here to tell us where you are watching from. Write in the comments the name of your city, your country, the soil beneath your feet. Bright Africa reads every one of them with immense gratitude, and we send to each of you a heartfelt wish. May your journey be filled with dignity, hope, and light. This is more than a video. It is a gathering of voices across the globe, united by a shared understanding that freedom is not given but taken. The price paid for this transformation cannot be measured in dollars or counted in years. It was paid in the dreams deferred of an entire generation, in the potential squandered, in the brilliance suppressed. For 40 years, Uganda's youth had been forced to choose between exile and submission. Now, for the first time in their lives, They could choose hope. The lessons of Uganda's liberation spread across Africa like seeds carried on the wind. In countries still trapped under the weight of hereditary rule, young people asked why they should accept what their Ugandan counterparts had rejected. The model that Ibrahim Traore had pioneered in Burkina Faso, dignity before dependency, sovereignty before submission, was no longer an isolated experiment but a continental awakening. The international community, which had spent decades managing African conflicts rather than resolving them, found itself confronted with something they had not anticipated: African solutions to African problems. The arrest warrant that had started this entire crisis became irrelevant not because it was withdrawn, but because the man it targeted had become powerless. There is profound justice in the realization that the dynasty which had ruled through fear ultimately died from irrelevance. The Museveni era ended not with the bang of revolution but with the whisper of indifference. When a people stopped fearing their oppressors, those oppressors ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Yet this transformation came at a cost that we must acknowledge with both regret and resolve. We look back at the stolen decades, the suppressed votes, the brilliance of minds that were forced into exile or silence, and we feel the weight of what might have been. Uganda could have been a beacon of development, democracy, and dignity. Instead, it became a cautionary tale of how power without accountability corrupts not just leaders, but entire nations. But from the ashes of that regret rises something more powerful: hope. Hope that the next generation of African leaders will learn from both Traore's example and Museveni's failure. Hope that the continent's youth will no longer accept that suffering is their birthright. Hope that the voices of dignity will drown out the whispers of dependency. As we prepare to end, remember, this is not the conclusion of the story, but the seed planted in the soil of your consciousness. Every narrative of dignity, every voice of sovereignty, is part of a harvest that lies ahead. If you want to see that harvest grow, subscribe to this channel, not because we ask for numbers, but because we are building a space where voices of independence are honored, where stories of African pride continue to be told. By subscribing, you are not just supporting us, you are choosing to walk with us into the next chapter of Africa's unfolding renaissance. Your subscription is not for us alone, it is for the promise of what is still to come. Join us and stand ready for the chapters that are already being written across the continent. The story that began with broken glass in Nigeria ended with broken chains across Uganda. But more importantly, it revealed that the power to break those chains had always resided in the hands of those who wore them. Ibrahim Traore did not liberate Uganda. He simply reminded Ugandans that they had always possessed the key to their own liberation. The revolution was not imported in the cargo holds of foreign planes or dictated in the resolutions of distant parliaments. It was homegrown, authentic, and unstoppable. Today, as young Ugandans wake up in a country where their voice matters more than their silence, where their dreams are valued more than their submission, they understand that Ibrahim Traore's greatest gift was not his words but his example. He showed them that sovereignty is not negotiated, it is declared. That dignity is not granted, it is claimed. That the future belongs not to those who wait for permission but to those who act with purpose. Burkina Faso lit the torch, but the fire now burns in every heart that refuses to bow. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice when justice is demanded rather than requested. Stand tall, stay vigilant, and remember, the dawn does not ask permission from the night to break.